5 smooth stones show up in almost every telling of David and Goliath, and almost every telling gives the same reason for them. It is not the chapter's reason. It is not in 1 Samuel at all. 1 Samuel 17 is one of the most retold pages in the Bible. Children act it out with paper swords. Coaches quote it in locker rooms. Somebody reads it out loud in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, because it is the one story everybody in that room already knows. And somewhere along the way, the version most of us carry picked up 3 things the chapter never says: a number, a question, and a handful of stones. Hold all 3, because not one of them breaks the story. They do not turn it into a lie. They turn it into something stranger, quieter, and a great deal harder to preach. One honest word before we start. This is not an accusation. Nobody built the popular version to fool anybody. People built it because they loved this chapter and wanted it to add up. Start with the ground, because the ground can still be walked on. The chapter opens with an address, not a moral. The Philistines gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and camped between Soko and Azekah, at a place called Ephes Dammim. Israel camped in the valley of Elah. Elah is the Hebrew word for the terebinth, a broad, low-shade tree that grows all through that country. So picture the valley of the big trees, a dry stream bed running down the middle of it, and an army camped on each ridge, looking straight across at the other one. Those are not decorative names. They are map coordinates, and every one of them can be checked with a shovel. In 2007, an archaeologist named Yosef Garfinkel put a team on a hilltop called Kirbet Keyafa. It sits directly above that valley and looks down the road that runs toward Philistine country. He dug there until 2013. The hill gave up a fortified city, a double ring of walls, 2 gates, and carbon dating that lands right around the year 1000 before Christ, the century this book puts David in. Scholars still argue about who built it and what to call it, and that argument will not be settled here. But notice what they are arguing about now: a wall. Somebody put a real fortress on that hill, in roughly the right century, staring straight down the Elah Valley. Gath is real too. It is a mound in central Israel called Tel Es-Safi, and an archaeologist named Aaron Meir has been digging it since 1996. In 2005, his team lifted a broken piece of pottery out of a layer from around the 10th or 9th century before Christ. Somebody had scratched 2 names into it, Alwat and Walat. Those are not Hebrew names. They are Philistine, and they are built from the same root that gives us the name Goliath. Hold that loosely. Nobody has dug up Goliath, and that piece of pottery is not his mailbox. It shows one narrow thing, and the narrow thing is still worth having. At Gath, in about the right century, men walked around with names shaped like his. So the valley is real, the towns are real, and the enemy city is real. The trouble starts at verse 16. The Philistine came out morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. 80 appearances, 2 armies watching, and nothing happening on either ridge. Armies in that part of the world settled wars this way on purpose. Both sides hold their ground, each one sends out a single fighter, and whatever happens between those 2 men decides it for everybody standing behind them. The whole point was to spend 2 lives instead of 2,000. And it needed one thing Israel could not produce for almost 6 weeks: a volunteer. Which brings the first of the 3 details, the number. Every version of this story says the same thing. Goliath stood over 9 feet tall. That comes from verse 4, and the Hebrew text most Bibles print says he measured 6 amah and a zeret. An amah is a forearm, elbow to fingertip. Call it 18 inches. A zeret is the width of an open hand, thumb tip to little finger, about 9. 6 forearms and 1 handspan, stacked end to end, comes out at roughly 9 feet 9. That is what one line of manuscript says. In 1952, in a cave near the Dead Sea, someone pulled a scroll of Samuel out of the rubble. Scholars call it 4Q Samuel A, which only means the first Samuel scroll out of Cave 4 at Qumran. It was copied in the last century before Christ. Where the printed Hebrew says 6 forearms, that scroll says 4. The Greek Old Testament says 4 as well. So does Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century. He put down 4 cubits and a span without a word of explanation. The way a man writes a number, everybody already uses. 4 forearms and a handspan is about 6 feet 9. And the ages here matter. The Hebrew text behind nearly every English Bible on a shelf today comes from a manuscript finished in the year 1008. That scroll from the cave was already 1,000 years old by the time the scribe of that manuscript sharpened his pen. The older surviving copy is the one that says 4. Hold both numbers side by side, because the gap is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a monster and a very large man. It does not change who wins the fight. It changes who should have been fighting it. And that difference stops being trivia 7 chapters earlier. 1 Samuel chapter 9 introduces Saul. It says there was not a better-looking man in Israel. And then it adds this: from his shoulders and upward, he was taller than any of the people. Israel had a big man. By its own account, Israel had the tallest man in the country. And for 40 days, morning and evening, that man stayed inside his tent. At 9 feet 9, Saul's height is a footnote. Nobody is fighting that. At 6 feet 9, Saul's height is the whole problem. Israel had exactly one man who could have made it a fair fight, and he was the king. Now an honest note, because honesty is worth more here than a clean answer. The shorter reading carries its own trouble. Verse 5 puts the coat of mail at 5,000 shekels of bronze, somewhere around 125 pounds. Verse 7 puts the iron spearhead at 600 shekels, about 15. That is a crushing weight for anybody, and it argues for a very large man on either reading. The manuscripts disagree, and they have disagreed for 2,000 years. Anyone who says the case is closed is selling something. Second detail, the question. Read the last 4 verses of the chapter slowly, because these are the ones people quietly stumble over. Verse 55. Saul watches the boy walk out toward the Philistine, turns to Abner, the commander of his army, and asks, "Whose son is this youth?" Abner answers, "As your soul lives, O king, I cannot tell." Verse 56. Saul tells him to go and find out whose son the boy is. Verse 58. David comes back holding the head, and the king asks him to his face, "Whose son are you, young man?" A lot of people read that and feel something catch. 1 chapter earlier, David is already inside Saul's household. In chapter 16, a servant recommends him by name and by family, a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. David plays the harp for Saul. Saul loves him greatly and makes him his armor-bearer. So does the king of Israel not recognize his own harp player? 2 serious answers, and scholars disagree about which one is right. This is one of the most discussed manuscript problems in the whole Old Testament, and nobody has closed it. The first answer is about manuscripts. One of the oldest complete copies of the Greek Old Testament, a 4th century book that sits today in the Vatican Library, does not contain that scene at all. Verses 55 through 58 are simply missing. So are verses 12 through 31, the stretch where David arrives at the camp as a stranger carrying bread and cheese. Take those out and the chapter runs perfectly smoothly. The harp player Saul already knows steps up and fights. Some scholars read that as 2 older tellings, stitched together later. Others think the Greek translator trimmed a chapter he found repetitive. Nobody today knows which came first. The second answer sits inside the Hebrew, and English hides it. Saul never asks the boy's name. 3 times he asks whose son he is. Ben Mizeh, whose son is this? And the word he uses for the boy is nar. Not man, not soldier, a young male still known by the household he belongs to, the kind of boy a father sends out with lunch for his older brothers, which is exactly what David was doing when he arrived. And a king had a reason to want the father, specifically. Verse 25, in the mouths of the soldiers standing around the camp, whoever kills this Philistine, the king will make him rich, and give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel, free. No tax, no forced labor, for the whole household, permanently. Saul is not failing to place a face. He is asking where to send the reward. This is not a memory problem. It is bookkeeping. And the boy answers in kind. He does not say, "I am David." He says, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite," which leaves the stones. Verse 40. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook, put them in a shepherd's bag, and his sling was in his hand. 5. The chapter says 5 and then says nothing else about it. No reason, no arithmetic. It is one of the quietest verses in the whole story, and it has produced more sermons than almost any other line in the book. It does not explain itself. It never has. The sermon most people know goes like this. Goliath had 4 brothers, so David took 1 stone for the giant and 4 more for the family. Faith and preparation. It is a good sermon, preached from good pulpits by people who meant every word of it. It also turns up, written kindly, in the comments under nearly every video ever made about this chapter, from someone trying to help. So go and read the 4 brothers. They are in 2 Samuel 21, and the first thing to notice is when. Not in the valley. Decades later, at the end of David's reign, in a different war altogether. David is no shepherd boy in that chapter. He is a king with a palace and a standing army, and the men doing the killing are professionals who have been on his payroll for years. 4 Philistine fighters, each one described as oversized. A man named Ishbi-Benob, carrying a spearhead of 300 shekels of bronze. A man named Saph, a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and a man killed by a soldier named Elhanan. Now, the 4 brothers' sermon gets something right that people rarely give it credit for. The chapter does count them. Verse 22. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath. The number 4 is genuinely there. But look at the Hebrew word, sitting behind the English word giant, because it is not doing what the translation makes it look like. It is not a description. It is Rapha, with a the welded onto the front of it, the way a family name sits on a mailbox. These 4 were born to the Rapha in Gath, not to Goliath, to the household Goliath came out of. Only one of the 4 is ever called his brother. 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5. Elhanan killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. And even that verse comes with a not in it. The matching line over in 2 Samuel says, Elhanan killed Goliath himself, and the English translations quietly borrow the words, the brother of, from Chronicles, to smooth it over. That knot is real, it is old, and nobody has untied it. And then there is the part of that chapter almost nobody reads out loud. David does not kill them. They are not his kills at all. Verse 22 says, These 4 fell by the hand of David, and by the hand of his servants, and the chapter has already told us which. Ishbi-Benob came at David and nearly finished him. David had grown weary. A younger man, Abishai, stepped in and saved his life. Afterward, David's own soldiers made him swear an oath, You will not go out with us to battle anymore, so that the lamp of Israel is not put out. That is the real sequel to the 5 stones. Not 4 more victories, 1 rescue, and a forced retirement. So the sermon has David carrying 5 stones for 5 giants he will personally kill. The chapter has him carrying 5 stones for a reason it flatly refuses to give. And then, 40 years down the road, it has him pulled off a battlefield by a younger man and told to go home. Every retelling makes David bigger. The chapter keeps making him smaller. And why 5? Nobody knows, and that is the honest answer. Some point to the size of a shepherd's bag. Some point out that a smooth stone is not something a person finds instantly in a stream bed, so anybody down there would gather a few while he was looking. Both are guesses. The text leaves a blank and walks on. A blank in a beloved story never stays blank for long. Now look at what all 3 editions have in common. 9 feet 9 instead of 6'9". A king who somehow does not know the boy, so the boy arrives from nowhere. 5 stones for 5 giants. Every one of them makes David larger, the odds longer, the win more spectacular. And every time, the chapter pulls the other way. It calls him a nar. It has the commander of the army admit he cannot place him. It has him answer the king by naming his father. And it never once tells us what he felt. It does not say he was afraid. It does not say he was brave. It says he ran toward the battle line. That is all we get. So this next part is for one particular person. Maybe you have sat through a service while this story landed on you like an assignment. Be brave. Be the giant killer. 5 stones, no fear. And then you walked out to the parking lot quietly certain that you are not that person. Stay with me for a minute. You already know your own list. Not the giants you beat, the other ones. The conversation you have rehearsed in the car for 6 years and still have not had. The name you scroll past every Christmas because you would not know what to say. The prayer you stopped praying, not because you stopped believing, but because it had started to feel like paperwork. The room you stopped speaking up in, because the last time, nobody looked up. And underneath all of it, a story somebody handed you in good faith about a boy who was braver than you are. That is not the boy in the chapter. The boy in the chapter is so small the king has to ask twice who his father is. He is so hard to place that a professional soldier standing beside the throne says out loud, "I cannot tell." He goes down to a streambed and picks up 4 more stones than he is going to use. He answers the king of Israel by naming a farmer in Bethlehem. And it is enough. Notice what he never gets, either. In the whole chapter, not one character ever speaks his name. The king calls him a youth. His own brother calls him you. The giant calls him a dog. He is somebody's son, somebody's little brother, the boy sent out that morning with 10 cheeses for a captain. That is the person the text walks down into the valley. So if you have spent most of your life being the one who carries the cheese, you are not standing outside this story looking in. You are standing exactly where it starts. That is what the bigger version quietly costs you. This is not a story about a brave boy. It is not a story about a big man either. Make David 9 feet of courage with a 5-stone strategy, and the chapter becomes a description of a certain type of person. You either are one or you are not. Leave him a nar with somebody else's name in his mouth, and it stops being about size at all. It becomes a question about who was willing to walk down into the valley while the tall man stayed in his tent. You were never required to be the tall man. You were never Saul in that story. And if you have told the 5 stones version, at a Sunday school table, at a kitchen table, to a grandchild who was frightened of something, you did not mislead anybody. You handed on a story the way it was handed to you, and you handed it on because you wanted it to hold. It holds. It just holds differently than it was sold to you. If somebody you know has been quietly carrying the feeling that they are not brave enough for the version they were taught, send them this one. Every retelling makes David bigger. The chapter keeps making him smaller. And in this book, smaller is where the room is. That valley still carries a tree in its name, in Hebrew and in Arabic both. The streambed still fills after the winter rain, and the stones in it are still small enough to close a hand around. Go and read the chapter this week, slowly. Notice the blanks, and when you find one that a sermon filled in for you, do not be embarrassed by it. Somebody loved this story enough to fill it. Then pick up 5 anyway.